Hello and welcome to HIST 103. This is Derek Taylor, your professor, and this is the first lecture on the section of the course called the Classical Age. I'm calling of world history. We're talking about the types of civilizations, the eras of the great civilizations of Asia, Europe, and elsewhere, which sort of set the standard for a lot of the great world civilizations going into, even in the modern era, or at least until the modern era, in places like China, India, also Rome, Greece, and a few others. Persia I'll be mentioning, but starting with Greece, and we're starting where we left off, just on the cusp of the classical world and going up to the end of the Hellenistic era. We'll explain what that is in a moment. Just a couple of remarks on your readings for this week. It's a fairly short chapter in Sources of World Societies. Chapter 5 will give you excerpts from a few plays, tragedies of the Greek 5th century tragedians, Sophocles and Aeschylus. A selection from The Apology of Socrates, which is written by his student Plato as a recounting of his speech in defense of his trial, and a few images of the human form in how the Greeks saw these things. So, a little short chapter, give you a little taste of Greek culture. So, today in this lecture, let me share the slides. So the lecture is called From Classical to Hellenistic Greece. And the thing we're going to talk about here in this lecture, and we'll talk about, and it's interesting because this will not only be, this lecture will cover some stuff not only for this week, but in a couple of weeks, you're going to talk about India and classical India and compare it. And one of the chapters in Sources of World, in Worlds of History does this for you very well. And we're going to contrast the social order, the social structures of classical Greece with that of classical India. And one of the big differences is the city-state. The Greeks essentially invent the city-state and the polis, as we call it. And in fact, the word polis begins, like these cities grow up in the archaic period, we'll see in a second. The term polis really originally meant a defensive position, like a crag or a rock somewhere up high, where members of the community could gather in times of, like war or attack or something like this. Over time, it's going to come to mean a community that will supersede dynastic and tribal loyalties. And in particular, in Athens, one you're probably most familiar with, it's going to create something unique in world history, something I'm calling territorial sovereignty. I'll explain what this is and why it's important in a moment. And so it has at the center of its city life, it has these institutions, it has temples, but also has an agora, a marketplace. Most of these cities would, which will be both the marketplace and a civic center later on. Originally, it was just a space in the center of town where people discuss stuff. These are all part of the city-state, and again, it's crucial, obviously, for at least those societies that trace their history back to Europe. This sense of the city-state, this sense of a people. I haven't used the word democracy. You can use that. We'll get to that in a moment. It matters, but crucial for understanding why Greece is so important in all this. And as I mentioned before, these city-states emerged during the Archaic period. And just in the overall sense of this lecture, it's going to go through the Hellenistic period. These city-states are going to decline, really a brief period when they're actually active. And then they're going to be superseded by what we call Hellenistic monarchies. We'll get to that in a moment. And the two most important to note are Sparta and Athens. Both the two great powers of the period are very, very different. I use the word not in a modern sense, but constitutions, different types of cities, governments, and so forth. As you see, crucial to the political history of the era. So let's dive into this. The birth of the polis in the Archaic period. Just a few notes here. Talk about Sparta. Sparta has its origins in its city-state, its particular structure, in a war that was fought in the 7th century. In fact, a series of wars it fought. As you're going to see, Sparta is in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, in the southwestern part of Greece. and they fight people in the plains of Messenia, across the mountains of Messenia in this period. And they take the land there. Again, remember, Greece doesn't have much fertile land. They take it and they enslave the people of that region. They become serfs called helots. And what happens is they become the lowest rank in Spartan societies. Like all ancient societies, the Spartans, all of these were, societies are based on slavery. But helots outnumbered Spartan warriors 10-1. And it's sort of really gruesome. It's basically a military state is what it is, where you have an elite, class of warriors running things. It's probably based on the fact they have to control these slaves. And control is exerted over each Spartan from birth, each Spartan warrior. Because from birth, the ones who are going to, there's only like of the elite, maybe 1,000 who will actually be fully trained warriors. So they'll be taken from them, their children, and trained to serve the city-state. And this is one of the things we'll talk about here, is that loyalty to one city-state was almost absolute. It's one of the real important things to understand about why it's unique, but also why it produces, some of the ideas that it does that are so famous to us today. The competition between these city-states is fierce at its height. And basically, they have, I'll go through some of this in a moment, the structure of Spartan society. They have kings, they have councils and stuff like this. Mostly what matters is warfare. And you gain glory, you gain power, you keep it by winning in warfare and being balanced. Again, it's almost like a communist type of state. One of the weird things about Sparta is that their women actually had more legal freedom than they would in any other city-state. You wouldn't think that, much more than in Athens, for a variety of reasons. I won't go into. They actually, again, you read stories from ancient authors about, Spartan women sending their men off into battle and encouraging them to fight and go fight and die. And so they had, again, there was this sense among Spartan women, they had to raise these sort of, great warriors. And so it probably plays into it to a certain degree. But it also has to do with the fact that Sparta is such a militarized state. It tends to erase distinctions in a lot of ways, more so than other ancient societies could have, because warfare does that, by the way. War, it reduces life to simplicity, kill or be killed. It does, in fact, again, have elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. It has some councils. It has dual monarchs, as I mentioned before, 2 kings, even some councils, but it's not really, it's important, but it's not the most important thing about it. And they will eventually create their own sort of defensive league called the Peloponnesian League. But for a long time, the Spartans actually were a really conservative society. They hardly ever fought outside of the Peloponnesian Peninsula where they're located, partly because they only had, a handful of these great warriors. They didn't want to waste them. And so that's going to be part of this rivalry actually between Athens and Sparta, as we'll see. So they're the sort of, if you want to see this as like the Cold War, they're the communists. They actually had, by the way, one of the things, Plutarch, an ancient author, talks about the Spartans. They got a reputation for not speaking much, for being very terse. They're tough guys that don't talk much. The term laconic goes back to, there's a region of Peloponnese called Laconia. Comes from them. Their speech is laconic. But according to Plutarch, they actually, to discourage a lot of wealth, they used iron ingots for money instead of like gold or something and silver. And archaeologists actually found some of these iron ingots. That's how extreme the society could be. On the other hand, you have Athens, and Athens, like a lot of these cities in the classical era in the 5th century, was initially run by an oligarchy of aristocrats, which had no actual law code, written law code. It had a council of nobles, which more or less dominated Athenian life, and had elected magistrates called archons, usually one sole archon who would be an important ruler. And then it had an assembly of 4 tribes. This is important to note. Athens was traditionally divided into what they call tribes of people. Now, what happens is in the 7th and in the 6th century, The sale of wine and olive oil made the aristocracy rich, but it led to a social problem as you began to have agricultural imbalances where people are producing all this wine and olive oil, but other smaller farmers are going into debt. And by the 6th century, a lot of them gone into debt slavery, even as these aristocrats keep getting more wealthy. So now this leads to unrest, and it leads to a constitutional crisis in which the aristocratic families of Athens decide, in order not to be overthrown, they grant power to one man, a man named Solon of Athens. Which we'll get to in a moment. These are the regions of mainland Greece where most of the city-states are located. I mentioned this is the Peloponnesian Peninsula. There's Laconia. There's Sparta right here. This is Messenia, the region they conquer in the 8th to 6th centuries and enslave the Helots. And this is Attica, which you're going to see in a moment. This is the region that Athens controls. Not very large cities, by the way. The entirety of what we think of Greece is about the size of the state of Pennsylvania. It's not a big area. And again, very rocky, very mountainous, lots of islands. So the Athenians, in desperation, elect Solon as the main archon in 574 BC. And he's 24 years old or something like this, but he was respected by all, so that's what they gave him sort of dictatorial authority, which he used to make changes to the constitution. Actually gives them a constitution to a certain degree for the first time, codified Athenian law, regularized existing offices, but also created new ones. He divided the citizens of Athens into 4 classes. The wealthiest 2 classes would serve in the Areopagus. He also created a council of 400. And the third wealthiest class after it would serve as hoplites. Hoplites are the citizen soldiers of Athens. And they would also serve on this new council of 400 men to be elected by the whole assembly. And then the 4th class of citizens, the Thetis, would vote in the assembly of all citizens. And so he made these changes, and basically also what he did to sort of end the sort of crisis was he canceled all debts. He forbade future debts being secured by one person, so you couldn't be sold for your debts anymore. And he freed Athenians enslaved for debt. He basically enacted, if you know what it is, a debt jubilee, and freed everybody to solve the political crisis. And of course, by creating those offices, but also by expanding citizenship to include immigrants and merchants, he gave people, he broadened the political class in Athens. Again, this isn't a democracy as of yet, but it gets closer to that. And it makes it more of, one sort of community. However, in the middle of after he leaves office, and he leaves Athens after this, a tyrant will seize power in 546 BC named Pisistratus, who is someone who actually took advantage of social strife among aristocratic families who were fighting in the 560s, and he unites rural Athenians against the other great aristocratic families. One of the things to note here, I'm going to reemphasize, remember, Greece is divided by geography, and in Athens, there's a big distinction between, there's basically 3 main areas. There's the coastal regions, there's the inland peoples who live in the mountainous areas, and there's the urban and suburban areas. And he unites all these rural peoples against these aristocratic families who are fighting. And he was actually really popular. He was really shrewd, and he had a court popularity. He took power, increased the power of the government at the expense of these noble families. He built public works projects. He supported poets and artists. A lot of times when people seize power, they support poets and artists because they make for good propaganda. And he did as well. However, when he dies and leaves the scene, he tries to leave his power to his sons. Get to that in a second. This, by the way, is, again, a close-up of Attica. And just a note here, Athens is right here, the city itself. Basically, every city, every town in the region of Attica would be part of Athenian life. They'd be citizens of the city itself. So it doesn't represent just that little area there. It represents the whole area, the whole region there. And so what happens is that his sons, being unpopular, are driven out in 510 by an aristocratic revolt. They kind of turn against him, and they're led by a man named Cleisthenes. That should be Ei Cleisthenes in his name. In 508, he helped put together he helped drive out the last of the tyrants, his sons, but he also put together a new constitution, and this is what is usually marked out as Athens becoming a democracy. And what he really did was he created, really for the first time, not just him, he took measures that really made Athens, they've been kind of groping toward this, into a territorial state for the first time. And he did several things. One is that he increased the number of tribes that the people of Athens were divided into 10. And there were already these sort of local neighborhoods called demes, which he made the sort of basis of political life by including in all these tribes demes from each region, from at least 3 demes from the coastlands, the urban areas, and then the mountainous areas. And he did this and you'll read this, by the way, when you read Worlds of History in a few weeks, according to Aristotle. Again, part of the reason was just to break down, again, those local loyalties. Remember just how divided people are by these loyalties. And so each of these 10 tribes, which is, on the basis of their political life, when they vote together, they're basically treated together, those localities. So the point is, your loyalty is no longer to, again, the reason why we want to do that is because in your local area, you're more loyal to your family or your relatives. And what this does affect is basically change the structure so that it tries to make your primary loyalty to residents of Athens itself and its outlying areas rather than your relatives. It undercuts the personal ties that these aristocratic families had used to govern the city. Cleisthenes probably did this because he wanted to gain popularity, but it undercut that. It creates what we call territorial sovereignty. The sovereign are the people of this territory and not necessarily the relatives of aristocratic families or a dynasty or something like this. And he enlarged the council, making a council of 500 chosen by lot. All female citizens were enfranchised. A people's court was created in which citizens were paid to sit on juries. And so you have this total broadening of the political franchise, but you also have this shift to making it this territorial notion of loyalty rather than this. This is the big change. And it is something like, yes, it is something like our democracy, something like that. All the citizens, vote, all citizens have a say. However, Athens at its height had about 100,000 people. Only about 10% of the people, if that, maybe 20% could actually be citizens, maybe 20,000, maybe less. The rest would be women, children, slaves. So it's not exactly, but it is the basis of every modern state is something like this notion of territorial sovereignty. Very crucial development. I already mentioned the adult male population, all those sorts of things. And yes, any Athenian can submit or debate legislation, citizens. So and totally free and open debate. One last thing to note about this is that aristocrats were still powerful. They still had a big say in things. We'll get to this in a moment, but all free Athenians were now involved in civic life. And this leads us into what will become, because this happens by about 500 or so, Athens becomes what we think of as a democracy and a city-state. And almost at the same time, they come into conflict with one of the great powers of the ancient world, the Empire of Persia, which we'll talk about next time in more detail. But as you're going to see, there are Greek cities on the west coast of what's today Turkey, Asia Minor. They're conquered first by the kingdom of Lydia, then later on by Emperor of Persia, Cyrus, who conquers Lydia and gains control of these cities. And what's going to happen is they're going to, rebel against Greek rule. And This happens in 499. I have the date there for in the back right in a second. The Persians crushed the revolt pretty quickly, but Athens is drawn into the conflict. Why? Some of these cities appeal for their help. And apparently the new democratic Athenian state couldn't help intervening on behalf of fellow Greeks against what they saw as barbarian tyranny in the Empire of Persia. And so this brought the Greeks to the notice of the Persians for the first time. And the successor of Cyrus the Great, Darius, made a point of trying to go and teach the Greeks a lesson. So he invades northern Greece and Macedonia in 492, and then makes his way into mainland Greece in the year 490. And in a dramatic scene, they're going to punish the Spartans, just the Spartans, just the Athenians. When the Athenians call for help, the rest of the Greek city-states, particularly Sparta, right? They're the military geniuses of the Greeks. They refuse. Said, you're on your own. In fact, basically nobody comes to their aid. And instead, they send out the entire citizen army of Athens, about 10,000 troops, hoplites, heavily armed soldiers with a shield and a spear, to go against the much larger but less well-armed Persian army, something like, again, maybe 50,000 troops. That's a big, they're very much, the numbers are always, by the way, hanky with ancient sources. People, they like to inflate numbers, but they were outnumbered badly. And in a shock, and this was a shock, Persia was the greatest power in the world as far as people knew the world at that point in that region. They didn't know about Greece, they didn't know about China. So, but they beat them at Marathon, the Battle of Marathon. This is, by the way, this is the story of Phidippides and the marathon. The story where we get the marathon from, like he ran 26 miles to give the message back. Long story. This is where this comes from. But it sent shockwaves. Their victory under Miltiades, the leader of the Greek hoplites. And it set shockwaves because this was not just a victory, it was an ideological victory, right? Because the hoplite army represented democracy in arms, and it had won over against the conscript army, partly conscript army of the Persians. So this sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean world. However, the danger wasn't over, because Darius was planning to come back when he died in 486. And then in 482, his son Xerxes began his invasion with an even larger army. And the Athenians panicked when he did this. They actually consulted the oracle at Delphi and what they're supposed to do. And you know, the oracle at Delphi is there's a priestess there. You ask a question, she would go in there, go into a trance, and then give you an answer to your question. So the story goes, they went in there to ask, what do we do? Because this massive, 150,000 man army is coming in. And basically, it's something, I can't remember the exact words, like, why do you sit here in despair? You're all going to die. It's basically this message of doom. The assembly freaks out, but they had one leader, a guy named Themistocles, someone who was a shrewd guy. He'd been actually waiting for this because he had participated in the last battle at Marathon, and he knew the Persians were coming back. However, it was politically dangerous to mention this because nobody wanted to talk about it and face that reality. He had spent the last 10 years building up the Greek navy, and so he kept his calm, and he sent the messenger back to the oracle to get another message. And the message that came back was something to the effect of, you must put your trust in your wooden walls. And nobody had any idea what they were talking about because the walls of Athens aren't wood. He interpreted it to mean the walls of your ships. And he'd been building up his navy because he had a naval strategy for beating the Persians. Basically, what he did was he evacuated the entire city of Athens, relocated to an island off the coast. The people of Athens watched from that island as Xerxes entered the city and burnt it to the ground. But the strategy worked. They attacked his supply ships. He was way far from his base in Persia. And at a humongous victory in 479, the Athenian fleet destroys the main Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis, in the Straits of Salamis off the coast of Athens. Effectively, the war's over. He can't supply himself. There's a few more battles. The Battle of Thermopylae, Hopefully, you haven't seen that awful movie 300. But the Spartans finally started to contribute something in this battle. The final battle is the Battle of Plataea in 478, but it's a victory for the Greeks because they did pitch in this time, but it's particularly seen to be a victory by the Athenians because they're the ones who held out. It's their navy that did this, so it's a triumph for them. And this will spur 150 years or so of almost unmatched cultural achievement. This victory leads to what we call the golden age of Greek civilization. And as you're going to see, the Athens comes out of this the clear winner. They're going to have a rival in Sparta, and they'll sort of face off first diplomatically and then later on in military terms. But it sets the stage, does the victory over Persia. And what it does is that in response to after their victory over the Persians, they formed to the Athenians a league, a defensive league, naval league, which is successful against the Persians to defend against further Persian aggression. It's under the leadership of people like Simon Tides in 449 to prevent, because the Persians do try to get their revenge. The Persians will get their revenge another way, and they defeat them in 467, but they'll get their revenge another way. But they create this defensive naval, as you'll see in a moment, the map of it, this naval defensive league against the Persians. And here, by the way, is just the overall view of the Greek world, just to give you a sense of, okay, what we're talking about. This was Lydia up here. This is the Greek world, little western coast of Asia Minor. This is the mainland. This is the north. This is Macedonia. We're going to come back to Macedonia in a second because, of course, Alexander the Great. And so, and you have down here the Greek islands over here, and then Crete. This is mostly the Greek world here. There's also some stuff out west when I get into here right away. And so this leads to, and eventually will come to power, the great leader Pericles, who is the aristocrat, someone who comes from an aristocratic family, becomes the sort of leader of Athens during its heyday in after 450 or so, after 449. And he represents kind of the best and worst of Athenian life. He's a great orator. He's the brilliant, thinker in his own right. He gathers around him a coterie of philosophers, and we'll get to them in a moment, historians, the first historians, writers, artists. He is the kind of leader you'd like to have. On the other hand, he pushed a foreign policy which is expansionist. The Athenians essentially turned themselves into an empire. Athens bullied other city-states. It used its superior navy and its superior economic power to secure domination of other Greek city-states. And it effectively turned the Delian League, which was supposed to be a defensive league, into an imperial system. Not to be political, but think NATO. And that's what you're kind of thinking about here. So it led to, in some ways, it led to its rise, it led to its fall. Victory always leads to arrogance and hubris, if you like. And that's kind of what happens with Athenian democracy. And this, by the way, is just a map of how far this Delian League persists. And you can kind of see there just where it goes, all the way up into Thrace, all the way around the Aegean Sea and down the coast of Asia Minor. And then these are dependent members. In other words, these are the ones they actually bully and threaten. They also have allied members up in Greece, in Thessaly, Boeotia, state of Thebes, Corinth, over here. Not merely allies. The rest of these are their dependents. Here's the island of Delos. That's where the treasury is kept for this. So they turn this defensive league to their empire, effectively. Now, what happens is that for a time, you're going to have peace between Athens and Sparta, but they're kind of eye each other for many decades. Again, sort of like the U.S. and the USSR during the Cold War. What will happen in the 430s, late 430s, is you're going to have a trade dispute break out between two of Sparta's allies and Athens. And when the Spartans issue an ultimatum for the Athenians to back off their allies, Pericles refuses and goes to war. The historian Thucydides will blame the war on Sparta's fear and jealousy of Athenian power. Nonetheless, they go to war. Pericles had been itching for war, by the way. He, at least according to some ancient authors, he seemed to be want to make Athens more glorious. And they took different strategies. The Spartans wanted to invade and they wanted to get a battle in open field, because they knew they could defeat the Athenians on land. The Athenians, Pericles' strategy was to bring the entire surrounding population of Attica into the walls of Athens. And they had walls running down to their port, Piraeus, on the sea, and then have Athens supply its food and everything by its allies from the sea. In other words, fight them on where we're best equipped with our navy, and make raids on the coast, because the Spartans didn't have a navy. Unfortunately, this is why you don't do stupid things like start wars, because I'm not going to have much time to go through this, but the Peloponnesian War transformed Sparta. Sparta had never had a navy before. They built the navy. They had never fought much outside of Sparta. They started fighting all over the place. They brought forth leaders. They became diplomats, by the way. One of their allies in the war was Persia, in order to sort of get back at the Athenians. But unfortunately for the Athenians, what happens is they brought all those people into the city. As you know, if you have a lot of people in close quarters, they tend to spread diseases. A plague swept through Athens in 429, killing Pericles. And there's a couple of different truces. There's a peace in 421. There's a series of disasters with the Athenian general Alcibiades. And it goes on for 20 years or so, but they really weren't out of it until 413, when the Athenians tried to invade Sicily. And in that naval conflict, the Athenian navy is almost entirely wiped out. At that point, it was only a matter of time. Almost 10 years later, in 404, the Athenians surrender the Spartans, who tear down their city walls, install an oligarchical puppet government, and forbid the Athenians to build their navy again. And this is the end of the Athenian Golden Age and the end of its time as a great power. So let's talk briefly about culture in the Golden Age of Athens and Greece, more generally speaking. And one of the things to note about this is it should be 5th century culture, not ulture, not vulture, but 5th century culture. One of the things that produces all this is this conflict, not necessarily the war, but the tensions of the polis itself, the tensions of the various city-states. Again, I mentioned before how intensely loyal everyone was to their city-state. And there's this chauvinism about this pride in the city-state, and the concomitant, denigration of other city-states. I had the people in these city-states, it's kind of hard. It's hard to explain almost just how competitive they were, how chauvinistic they were. Each city-state thought they were an island of civilization in a sea of barbarism, that they were sort of the lone, bastion of civilization surrounded by, marauders or something. I had a friend of mine, a colleague at KU years ago, try to give you an analogy as just how much tension there was. He said, imagine the modern state of Israel, right? Modern state of Israel surrounded by, hostile powers that want to, destroy it, where every male, actually every citizen in Israel has to serve in the army. We live in that sort of constant state of almost emergency. Imagine like 36 or so, or how many cities there were, a couple of dozen Israels, all crammed into a territory the size of Pennsylvania, and you'll get a sense of the tensions. It's that sense of competition, both individually and as states, that fuels the cultural achievements of the age. trying to outdo each other. Pericles in his famous funeral oration. This is his oration during the first years of the Peloponnesian War, extolling the sacrifices of Athenian citizens in the war. And he refers to Athens as what he calls the school of Hellas. Hellas is another name for Greece. He means that because the Athenians are so cultured, because they're so sophisticated, because they do philosophy and stuff like this, their purpose is to educate the rest of the Greek world. You can imagine how this might have gone over with the rest of the Greek city-states. But of course, that's what we remember about this era. Remember, of course, the Parthenon. Remember how Xerxes had burned the city to the ground during his invasion? Well, Pericles, well, not just Pericles, other Greek leaders rebuilt the temple at the top of the Acropolis, dedicated to Athena, with a gigantic statue of her in there. And so all these great public work projects that Pericles undertook was meant to project the greatness of the city and its greatness over the other cities in Greece. This is also a time, of course, you have the rise of tragedy. And this is also a matter of competition. If you don't know, Greek drama originated in religious festivals in the ancient world. There are two festivals called the Greater and the Lesser Dionysia, under the god Dionysius, in which, and these are basically, by the way, these are basically democratic festivals. They're festivals in which the entire city would stop working. Every citizen would go to the theater, the Dionysius Eleutheria. I'll show you a picture in a second, on the side of the Acropolis, to hear these plays. And they originated out of religious ritual. And you have these competitions every year, who had the best tragedy. And by the way, they would, how would you know who won? You'd have the crowd tell you. They'd boo and hiss if they didn't like stuff. They were pretty open about it. And you'll get this great, flourishing. And these are the three great tragedians: Aeschylus, the one who fought the Battle of Salamis in the Persian War, the older one, with his great Orestia, his trilogy about Orestes, the son who avenges his father's death, Agamemnon, the hand of his mother at the Trojan War. Sophocles, his great trilogy of Oedipal trilogy, Oedipus the king, Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone, and then Euripides, the last one. And they would fight to win, but whatever the crown, the competition at these festivals every year. You also have comedy, and comedy is a little bit different because for the most part, tragedy doesn't deal with contemporary events, at least not directly. Comedy deals with direct people in Athens. Aristophanes was famous for his plays mocking Socrates, for example. If you've ever read, oh boy, it's called The Clouds. That's the one where he has Socrates going around investigating the size of gnats' anuses. It's meant to be a send-up of absent-minded, philosophers who are discussing minutia and bothering everybody. So comedy as well at the time, great tragedy. And this is the Dionysia Eleutherius on the side of the Acropolis. Could hold about 14 to 15,000 people, which is about the size of the citizenry of Athens at its height. Excuse me. You also had historians, people who were, again, part of Pericles' circle. Herodotus, in his histories, is more or less credited with inventing history. It's not exactly the kind of history you're used to. If you read his histories, they're kind of like long digressions. It's actually supposed to be about the Persian War. The thing that Herodotus was trying to understand was, okay, because he's from Ionia, how did the Athenians beat the great empire? And he goes and tells all these sort of mythological tales and wild stories about the origins of Persia and the origins of all these other sorts of things. He's an interesting person to a certain degree, and he's trying to explain how this came about and draw lessons from it. And so he's usually considered the father of history. On the other hand, you also have Thucydides, who is a very different figure, sometimes seen as someone who anticipates modern history. He writes, of course, his history of the Peloponnesian War, trying to account for how Athens, trying to account for why the Athenians got beat in the Peloponnesian War, And he did more differently than Herodotus, who relied on, personal sources. He knew, he talked to people, Persia and places like that, Egypt. He used evidence. He also used, human evidence, but he also used documents and tried to discover meaningful patterns of human behavior, more analytic. Herodotus loved a good story, whereas Thucydides wants to analyze things. And he, in particular, saw human greed and desire for power as the main cause of the war with Sparta. And he tends to have a very hard-headed view of human nature, also a product of this age. And then, of course, you have the rise of the main line of Greek philosophy with Socrates. Socrates was a former stonemason from the lower orders, lowest classes of Athenian citizenship, who abandoned his wife and kids to go around discussing moral questions, ethical questions, with people in Athens. He actually fights, by the way, in some of the battles of the Peloponnesian War. He actually, at one point, tries to get some Athenian soldiers who were condemned to death off from their punishment. Doesn't succeed. But he goes around, apparently, as far as we can tell from Plato, his students' dialogues, he goes around sort of kind of calling into question a lot of conventional beliefs. This doesn't actually go down very well. And so when the city, surrenders, eventually overthrows in 399, the government the Spartans had installed in Athens, they are looking for scapegoats, and they pick on Socrates for several things. They accuse him of undermining belief in the gods, of introducing new gods, and particularly of corrupting the youth of Athens. And he's given a choice. He can actually go into exile. And by the way, if you read part of his Apologia. Apology, by the way, doesn't mean, the ancient Greek doesn't mean like I'm sorry. It means a defense. So he's definitely not apologizing in an English sense of the term. But he tries to explain his philosophical wanderings and why they were really good for the city, even though they wound up killing him. Actually, he could have left, but he actually says he can't go. He's been a citizen his whole life. He's lived at the expense of the city, and he drinks the hemlock and dies in 399. So he emerges almost as a sort of new type of philosophical hero who goes to his death bravely. At least as he's presented by his student Plato, who was present at his death, who after his death will leave Athens, go around the Mediterranean world, and eventually he will come back and found his academy in 387, I think it is. And he is mostly known for sort of extending, we think, Socrates' thinking in a different direction. I think I remember this in earlier lecture, I don't know, on the axial age perhaps. Socrates was someone who raised questions, didn't really try to answer them, at least from the middle part of his career, his dialogues, famous dialogues that centered on Socrates. He begins to put new ideas in his mouth, ideas that seem to give some answers to these things. Because one of the things Socrates is doing is calling into question things that seem to be, settled. And what Plato seems to grope for, at least in the middle part of his career, is things that will, transcend common opinion, proofs that are beyond, our sensible experience. And this leads him to something called the theory of the forms, which he is famous for. Stuff that is supposed to exist at a real high level of abstraction beyond the senses. And by the way, you usually hear this, in high school explanations of this. This meant everything in the world has a sort of ideal form of it beyond the senses. It's not really true. There's the usual example is a chair has a sort of ideal type of a chair somewhere in the ether, the floating around. That's not true. It's not things that can be created. It's usually things that are abstractions like beauty, number, bigness, equality, small, those sorts of things, abstract qualities rather than sort of physical thing. And he did a lot with mathematics, this Plato, in his work. And in that sense, I use the word idealist in quotation marks. He's not, don't confuse that with a modern notion of what idealism is in modern philosophy. Don't go telling your philosophy professors that I told you that Plato was an idealist philosopher, but he's more idealistic in that sense. He has a real strong sense that you can get, at least in those middle dialogues. Later on, there's some, seemingly in his later dialogues, there's some walking back from that, but he's famous for that. He's also famous for his student, Aristotle. Aristotle is a thinker, founds his own academy called the Lyceum. He's a little less, again, in that sense, idealist, a little more realist. Again, a little less extreme in his insistence on getting beyond the senses. He actually doesn't insist on that. He actually says that all knowledge begins in the senses and then is sifted from it by a dialectical reasoning itself and abstracted from it. And his theory of he actually has a theory of forms, but it's not nearly, it doesn't mean there. It means a sort of, different. I won't go into this here, but basically it's a little bit more down to earth philosophy. It's the best way to put it. In any case, outgrowth of this great period of creativity, which does not last, as most things, it does not last, because in a brief time, really, the polis sort of decays, not just in terms of, well, its influence, but also as a social formation. You can see here, the 30 tyrants rule in Athens, expedition of Cyrus, or rebellious prince of Persia. As you see, the Spartans war against Persia. Spartans go to war against Persia. You have a regime of Sparta. As you're going to see, Sparta is going to try to dominate Athens after their victory. You're going to see Corinthian war. You see some other things here. Sparta seizing Thebes, the Second Athenian Federation. They'll found a new confederation. Thebans defeat the Spartans. They'll come back to that. Well, that's a huge one. And then the end of Theban hegemony in 362. But basically, for a time, the Spartans try to dominate the Greek world in exchange for their allyship with the Athenians in the war. They hand over a Union Greek city-states to Persia. They install 30 tyrants in Athens, and for the next several decades, they're going to fight on and off with several powers, particularly a Greek coalition of Greek states from 396 to 385. At the same time, they're fighting that war with Persia, so they fight this war with Persia, and Athens forms another alliance with the city-state of Thebes, and they and sort of drains their power. They again reconstitute their naval alliance in 378. But what happens is, as a result of this, is that Thebes will eventually become, in its own right, a threat, because in 371 the Thebans defeat the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra, and this is important because this is the first time a Spartan army, a full Spartan army with all of its, not just its foot soldiers, but its full complement of Spartan warriors is defeated in battle. And in fact, Thebes goes on to conquer Messenia, the western part of Sparta, and liberate it. They restore it to independence. This is the end, essentially, of Sparta as a major political power. Total change overnight. And it has, of course, almost immediately Theban, the city of Thebes, looking for hegemony over the Greek world. It has these great generals, Polybidos and Epaminondas. It begins fighting a series of wars with Athens. And you can kind of see this is Thebes' attempt to bully and dominate the Greek region. You can kind of see its allied states. You have Athens opposing it here. So yeah, you have this again, this back and forth. And the other Greek states we'll get to in a moment. This is Macedon. Athens tries to reconstitute a second Athenian empire. I told you in 378 they reconstituted the Delian League. And again, there's a response. There's a return to infighting and disorganization and warfare throughout the Greek world. And more importantly, Athens and Thebes and other cities basically drain each other's strength, fighting for supremacy, which in the end makes it possible for an interloper to come in and dominate the region. You can probably guess where this is going. In any event, by the time you get to the middle of 3rd century, the polis has begun to lose its centrality to Greek life. It's no longer the sort of absolute total focus of loyalty by the mid-4th century. The reason why is very simple. By this time, you're beginning to have more and more citizens, wealthy enough and not wanting to fight, basically paying people to take their place. The use of mercenaries becomes more and more prominent. And so there's no longer that absolute identification of being a citizen with doing all the things, basically being the government. You're a citizen of ancient Athens at its height. You are the government. You participate in the law courts. You go in the assembly. You'll maybe a priest. You'll perform rites. That's part of civic duty too. And you fight in wars. Well, by the time you get to this period, that's no longer the case. And in fact, what happens is the Delian League actually becomes, in some ways, it structures a sort of imperial bureaucracy, which replaces self-government. And so polis as a social formation, as a political formation, that's where we get the word polity from, declines and will be subsumed by another type of organization, as we will see. And that will be monarchy, and particularly as the emergence of a different type of Greek culture, usually called Hellenistic. And if you've ever heard that term before, Hellenism, the term Hellenism was coined, Hellenistic was coined in the 19th century by historians who historians in the 19th century were writing in the era when, modern nation states were being formed by revolutions, Republican revolutions. So they tended to see classical Greece as the pinnacle and everything else as a fall from it. So it meant to designate what came after the classical world, meaning as a sort of letdown. But it refers more broadly to the spread now of Greek civilization across the Mediterranean world, and a change. It's a different type of culture from what existed in ancient Greece. It goes along with it. It's associated, of course, with the rise of the kingdom of Macedon. Philip II, we'll get to him in a moment. He'll defeat basically conquers Greece in the 330s. His son, Alexander III, Alexander the Great, will take over, will create a great world empire and die. It's pretty easy to tell that story. That's the chronology of things here. But it's the spread of Hellenism. And it transformed Greek culture how? Just to give you what that means. On the one hand, it generally is seen as a little bit less sophisticated than the culture of the classical period. More, if you like, demotic meaning more populist, less sophisticated, but to a broader range of people, more expansive. In some ways, you're going to see the Hellenistic world, Hellenistic society is more open to a certain degree, more mobile than the city-states of ancient Greece. Ancient Greece, you can see you're sort of locked into your class, you're locked into your tribe. It's much more traditional. It's much more kind of claustrophobic. These cities are different. Democracy goes by the wayside, of course, and monarchy comes in it. And this basically means the period from Alexander the Great down to Julius Caesar, because there's a Greek world which will be conquered by Rome, and the influence of Macedonia, which is again a shift. I guess we talk about Macedonia here. I don't know if I'll show the map in a second, but I'll show you the map. I guess we'll talk about Macedonia. Then I have a map here. But go back. Macedonia is sort of, you've seen how it's north of the mainland Greece. It was kind of seen as the backwater. It wasn't seen as like being, fully Greek. Think of it as sort of like, I don't know, Kentucky or something like this. It was looked down upon, right? You come from the hinterlands. And one of the things about Macedonia is that it retained a form of government that had long since ceased to exist in the mainland, which of course is monarchy. And the guy who's responsible for transforming Macedonia into a great world power is not Alexander. It's his father, Philip II of Macedon. And he was born in Pella. And he was actually a younger son who wasn't expected to inherit the throne. However, his kingdom was constantly attacked by people on several sides. And both his father and his brother died in battle. And so he became king as a result of all this. Turns out to be a fortuitous thing, but he turned out to be one of the great sort of leaders in Western, maybe even world history. He was a brilliant diplomat, a very shrewd statesman. He began to sort of make treaties with other powers, play them off against each other. But he also was a great military leader. For a few years, he was held as a royal hostage at Thebes. Remember, Thebes had been for a time the dominant military power in Greece from the years 368 to 365. And again, we say royal hostage. I mean, as a means of guaranteeing, Macedonia's loyalty, that they weren't going to do anything to him. He was treated as a royal prince, so he had time to move around freely. And while he was there, he observed the military techniques of the Thebans, and he brought them back to Macedonia. Things like the Greek phalanx, the sort of square formation, shield to shield, in rows of soldiers. He which gave them individual commanders for better communication. Brought back a weapon from Thebes, the sarissa, a long spear, which would be used and held upright by the people in the phalanx. He also invested money in siege towers and catapults. In fact, his siege engines will actually transform warfare. They'll make resistance to Hellenistic armies impossible by cities. It's one of the things that leads to the downfall of the city as a political formation. But the biggest thing he did was he made the military a way of life for the Macedonians. He basically created the first professional army. He basically paid them well enough so they could do it year round. They didn't have to, in the past, you would have to sort of do it as a part-time job and go back to your farms and do the harvesting. He made it something they could do drill year round, so they became that much better as an army. He gave them all uniforms, made them swear a personal oath of allegiance to him. In other words, he created the political and military machine that made Macedonia a great power. And early in his reign, he was a shrewd guy. He'd actually admired Greek culture. He began attracting artists, poets, and scholars to his court at Pella in Macedonia. And what happens is he defeats his allies on each side of Macedonia. Eventually, the Greeks are fighting each other in the 350s. He is called in he's invited to come in and settle their disputes, which he does. He begins to displace. He gains a foothold in Greece. Eventually, begins conquering the city-states. The last one to fall is Athens in 338, the Battle of Chaeronea. And so he makes himself master of Greece. He does not become king of Greece. He creates a series of leagues modeled after, the Athenian leagues under Macedonian leadership. But it's basically, he's clearly in control effectively. So what happens is he just brings to an end Greek autonomy, but he knows he's deeply unpopular. And so he begins planning for an invasion of Persia. His idea is to unite the Greeks behind him by attacking their ancient enemy. He is assassinated at a banquet in 336 BC, however, and can't carry it out. Not really sure. The sources are kind of, again, ancient sources, Plutarch, other people like that, are kind of divided on this. There's some rumors that Alexander might have pulled this off himself, maybe with the help of his mother, we're not sure. But Philip is assassinated, and this brings his son Alexander to the throne, and he will complete this. And this is where he gets the name Great from. He invades Persia in 334, crosses the Hellespont over into Asia with no navy, and an army with only had supplies enough for 1 month to feed his army. And he proceeded to defeat the Persians in a series of battles, the Battle of Granicus River in 334, defeats the Emperor Darius and a full Persian army in 333, before laying siege to the city of Tyre and subduing it, effectively giving him control of the whole region. By the way, after the capture of the city, because they refused to surrender, he crucified 2,000 people. From there, he makes his way into Egypt, where he's greeted as the successor to the pharaohs. He actually goes into the desert in Egypt and consults an oracle there, which begins to style himself as the son of Zeus. At 331, he goes into Persia itself, and in 330, he burns Persepolis, goes to defeats the Persians at Gaugamela and Persepolis, and burns the buildings of Xerxes to the ground in retribution for his invasion. And eventually, Darius flees. He takes last Persian capital at Ecbatana, hounds Darius to his death. And for the next 4 years, he winds up wandering. He's taken over Persia. I'll explain next time. Persia extends almost into India. It's so big, and he spends his time wandering through there, founding Greek cities where he goes, up to along the Caspian Sea into modern day Afghanistan. Eventually makes it by 327 into the Indus River Valley. And is sort of fights a few battles with the Indian prince there, and only is stopped in 325 when his troops mutiny. They refuse to go any further, and he's forced to return. He goes back to the city of Susa in 324 and dies the next year in June in the city of Babylon after a bout of drinking at the age of 32. Just a couple of things about him, his personality. Again, you can best get this from reading Plutarch's His Life of Alexander. Again, certainly brave, certainly very physically gifted, certainly, again, it's about being a great general. Like, he was, again, I mentioned him crucifying people because he could be a ruthless, brutal SOB. And I see his reputation has taken a hit, obviously, in modern times. But he was seen as one of the great conquerors and monarchs of the ancient world, to be imitated for a long, long time. And so, whatever you think of him, he did, he achieved something, I guess, if conquest is great and everything. But more important for our purposes, world history, he spreads Hellenistic culture around the Mediterranean world by founding cities everywhere, many of them named after himself. Lots of Alexandrias out there. And by the way, some of these becoming sort of mixed cultures, because there's a mixture of population, Greeks with their native peoples in various places. So again, it's not totally, a sort of chauvinistic thing. It's not the same thing as the Greek city-state. However brutal his conquest may have been, here is the record of the conquest, the routes. Again, crosses into Asia, goes down into, all these other places, through Cilicia and Asia Minor, down through, Tyre, this way, back to Egypt, through Egypt, back through Syrian desert, down into Persia. And this is where he goes, into the Persian Empire. This is Persian Empire, all this up here, all up into places up here. And he eventually gets into, again, this upper regions here, and down, again, into the Indus area right here. Eventually has to turn back, comes back this way, and goes back along the coast, making his way back to Susa. And thus, Alexander the Great. However, he dies in 323. His empire does not really last very long as a single entity. It gets sort of carved up pretty quickly. He created he created this economic unit, one political unit. The economic and cultural unit will more or less last, but he creates, the political one will not, in 3 different generals take over different parts of his territory. And by the way, I list the parts of the territory, the Seleucids have Mesopotamia, Ptolemies have Egypt, and Antigonid dynasty has Macedon and Asia Minor. That'll change over time, a lot, except for the Ptolemies. They're in control of Egypt till the end. But Ptolemy was his general. Ptolemy I becomes emperor, king of Egypt, pharaoh of Egypt in 305, starting the Greek dynasty. Seleucus I founds the Seleucid dynasty, Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids actually get into the history of the ancient Israel in the later period, actually. And then they take over the old heartlands of the Persian Empire. And then Antigonus I becomes, when their general becomes king of Macedonia and parts of Asia Minor, but mostly Macedonia. After a while, they lose some of their territories. If you're wondering, by the way, 30 BC, 63 BC, 168, they're all conquered by the Romans. We'll get to them in a week or two. So and it produces this, again, this widespread cultures across these different territories: Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia. I should point out, by the way, I don't mean that every native person in Persia, every Persian was speaking Greek. They weren't. But I meant it created a sort of shallow but widespread culture among elites, where you would have the elites of Persian society, the elites of Syrian society, the elites of, in places like Egypt speaking Egyptian, but also Greek. It becomes a second language. And it becomes a second language because it's a different type of Greek. This is the spread of, should be a accent there, but the spread of Koine Greek. Koine Greek is a language which is a sort of simplified version of the Greek language, which becomes the lingua franca of the Middle East in that period, across that world. So this is what we mean by saying it's a little less sophisticated than its predecessors. And this is just a map of the successor kingdoms. Alexander, you can kind of see Antigonus the First here, and you have different rulers here, but again, he's going to have the rest of this eventually. And this part will actually be taken over by the Seleucids at a certain point, and other peoples. But this is the Seleucid Empire. You can see, going right up to the Indus River Valley, right up to will be the classical Indian civilization. So they're in contact, are these great civilizations at this point, and then Ptolemy's down here in Egypt. So finally, just to talk about some of the changes in Hellenistic society and culture and what made it different and unique, but also enduring to a certain degree. And the first thing to note is, again, you have a different form of government. It's monarchy. These are big impersonal monarchies. They're not quite like, earlier eras. They're much more, they're wealthier, first of all. They conquer more territories. Because they've conquered more territories, they have more under their control. But they do unite Eastern and Western peoples under their rule. Again, do not think of these as being multicultural societies. They're not. But as you're going to see, you're going to have peoples like, I'll show you a map in a second, in places like Alexandria and Egypt, you're going to have a Jewish quarter. You're going to have different peoples under their rule. Again, they're not treated equally necessarily. Well, they are if they sort of abandon their culture and become Greek. You can go Greek. You can take on the language. You can get it, but you have to abandon your heritage that way. And but Hellenistic monarchies are very different, more impersonal, more bureaucratic than life in the polis. They, in a lot of places, increase the size and efficiency of government a lot, especially in places like Egypt, which already had one. All this is harnessed by these monarchies to tax their people a lot more. Why? Because you need to tax people because you have these big armies to support now in these regions. And again, these Hellenistic monarchies are trading with peoples all along what will become the Silk Road, India, Arabia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and even linking up with China eventually. So it's a much more expansive world they inhabit. They need more money. I will mention, however, that cities are still important economically and politically throughout this era and throughout the Roman era. They never cease to be that. They all have constitutions like they would have had in the Greek world. They all, by the way, they all have gymnasia. They all have the things they had in the ancient world. They all think of themselves, by the way, as being, democracies, but they're not. They're subject to these monarchies because they're just a lot more powerful. As I mentioned before, Philip II developed these siege catapults that were so irresistible they simply couldn't hold out against the greater resources, militarily and financially, of these kingdoms. But more than this, these cities also they represent a different cultural and social term. If the height, as you're going to see, of your readings, I think, of Athenian and Greek society in the 5th century is, a sort of almost humanistic optimism about what things can do. It's going to kind of give way to a certain fatalism in a certain way. It's kind of bipolar. There's also still some optimism, but also a lot of fatalism. Just to give you an example, one of the more popular goddesses, I should say, popular goddesses that's worshipped in the Greek world in the Hellenistic period is the goddess Tyche. And the Tyche is the goddess of fate or fortune. There's a sense you have to appeal to all this for reasons that will become apparent in a moment. But even within the philosophical world, Plato's Academy, right, founded on this, this ideal of, Plato, the forms, and all this stuff, becomes a center of skeptical thinking. A guy named Pyrrho of Elis, skepticism about knowledge and what you can know. Aristotle's Lyceum becomes a center of literary, historical studies rather than his philosophical ones. So things shift to a large degree, partly because you're in this bigger impersonal world. It's not the same thing as the sort of, the Greek city states, the polis at its height had its problems, right? Chauvinistic. There's no social mobility, but it had advantages too. And just make the contrast here, talk about the biggest city of this world, which, by the way, I mentioned that word up there, oikumene. What does that mean? I'll come back to it, but Hellenistic geographers would refer to the world as the oikumene, meaning the inhabited world, the inhabitable world. And this is kind of illustrated by Alexandria, because the cities like Alexandria, Antioch later on, these Greek city-states, they're more like modern cities. They're not primarily political entities anymore. They don't have that function. They serve as cultural and economic centers. They're not traditional. They are constructed cities. As you're going to see in a moment, Athens is something that just grew up, willy-nilly by over time by tradition, right? I'll show you the difference in a moment. Whereas these, they have institutions like the Great Library, right? This is founded by, these Hellenistic monarchs. Why? Because they wanted to learn? Well, no, it's because they wanted to educate people, because they need people to run the imperial bureaucracy. But they do become a center for research. What the Great Library of Alexandria is for. It's meant to serve, though, the kingdom's purposes. It's not like, again, for its own sake with Socrates or something like this. And this society that it represents, cities like Alexandria, is more open. It's more mobile. You can rise up if you're a Greek and become wealthy if you're from a lower class in the imperial bureaucracy. Again, if you are a native speaker of some sort, whatever, you're a Persian or something like this, or a Jew, you throw off your culture, yeah, you kind of rise up too. I guess most don't want to do that. And these are, I should also mention, these are much bigger cities. Again, Athens only had 100,000 people at its height. Alexandria is 1 million people. It's huge. It's also more impersonal. There's more social dislocation. There's more poverty. I'll explain as I go on, but there's a difference. Let me show you the maps here. This is ancient Athens in its outline. You can see it. It's all around the city center. It's all around, again, the Acropolis, the top of the polis, the crag, the center of the city. We have you have the temple, you have the theater there, you have the Areopagus, the council, and then the agora. All grows up around this center sort of organically over time, like from time out of mind, right? Nobody remembered exactly when we started doing this. It's kind of shrouded in mystery, or not mystery, but shrouded in a time when this thing, nobody can remember when this thing wasn't there. That kind of traditional growth where it's not sort of done self-consciously, right? Contrast this, the way this looks. And then note as well, by the way, these are all, the center is, of course, a religious institution, a temple. In fact, all these are kind of religious institutions back then. Contrast that with Alexandria. It's a planned city. It's made, it has a grid street pattern. It has, institutions they built. The Pharos, the great lighthouse at Alexandria, the palace harbor there. It has, quarters for a Jewish quarter. There's no Jewish quarter in ancient Athens because the only people there are citizens or they're slaves and children, effectively. Whereas you have, people from other places sitting in this city. You have museums. I don't have the library on here for some reason. I also have something like, this is nice. They have the Serapeum. This is number 7 down here. You know what the Serapeum is? It's a temple to the god Serapis. And the god Serapis is actually, he's actually a made-up god. Seriously. He's a god combining Greek and Egyptian features that was sort of invented by, I guess, Greek theologians, I guess you could call them, as reconciling Greek, or as best they could, Greek and Egyptian civilization. By the way, the Greek temples, the Greek religion went on. They didn't mess with that. The Greeks did. They let that go. So, but still, you have this attempt to do all stuff. And this is the thing here about Hellenistic culture. It's not as traditional. It's much more, I don't know how to put this almost. It's more self-conscious. It's planned. it's less, there's less reverence for antiquity and things of this nature than you would have had in ancient Athens. The trade-off, by the way, is again, there's less community. Again, you have in a place like Alexandria, they'll dole out social welfare, right? They'll hand out grain, make sure people don't starve. But there's nothing like the sort of social safety net, if you like, that you had in the ancient polis. Now, you can't rise up in the ancient polis, socially speaking, but to give you one example, in the ancient polis, the city would actually raise orphans of soldiers who've died in battle for the city at state expense till they came of age. They would actually keep alive until they died draft animals that had been used for work on public works projects. Again, there went along with this that chauvinism and claustrophobic, demand for loyalty was they took care of the citizens. Whereas here it's like, we'll keep you alive. We don't really care if you live or not that much. So it's kind of an interesting change in these great cities. And this also leads to changes of ideas, change in philosophical ideas, particularly the rise of what's called Stoicism. Stoicism, if you don't know, is the philosophical system, which is probably the thing you most know about it. It's pantheistic. It effectively means that God and the world are one. God and nature are one. In fact, it's kind of hard to, if you ever read any Stoic philosophy, it sounds weird. They talk about the spirit all the time. They don't mean something non-physical. They're actually materialists. They're referring to something called the pneuma, which is this really, really thin layer of like material substrate that, fills the whole universe. And they believe this eternal reason, which represents this pneuma, fills all things. So God, that divine substance is in all things, the natural world, the inanimate world, those sorts of things. And the goal of human beings is to live in harmony with nature. To live in, they use this phrase all the time. The later Roman Stoic uses that phrase. As you know, we're supposed to live according to nature. That means living in accordance with the sort of design of the entire universe. That's the way to live a virtuous life, which they stress endlessly to these thinkers. Although earlier thinkers like Zeno of Citium, who's one of the founders of this, supposed to be the founder of this, they tended to have a more metaphysical. There's more metaphysics in their thinking than, say, later Roman thinking. But they thought this idea that there was this logos, this divine reason that permeates everything in nature, even though it's, again, it's a physical substance. And they thought of the entire world, and by extension, all human beings, as being very intimately connected in a sort of chain of causality. They believed that this divine intelligence, this logos, guided things in the world for the best, that it represented a benevolent unfolding of this divine purpose. This is what we probably know about Stoicism. They thought you should sort of bear with suffering, right? Because ultimately things work out for the best. And that's part of this. It's very much, again, a philosophical system fitted for an imperial world where it's big, it's impersonal, and it teaches the individual to sort of buck up and follow nature in the midst of all this, this much bigger universe than that people existed in previously. A very different type of philosophy which emerges in the Hellenistic world is that of Epicureanism. And one of the interesting things about this philosophical system, you probably associate it, by the way, with gluttony and getting, and having, whatever, having sex or whatever. It's not really what it means. Epicureanism is essentially the idea that, first of all, it's rationalistic. You need to achieve happiness through a life based on reason. But it's one in which the gods have no interest. The gods have nothing to do with human affairs. And the goal of all this is to liberate people from the fear of death and from the fear of the gods. It identifies happiness with pleasure, but again, it's not what you think. It's not anything positive. It's negative. Your goal is to get to what the Stoics talk about something like this, what's called apatheia, dispassion, or the absence of pain and trouble. In fact, I just take that back. The Stoics are a little more positive connotation for them, but But the Epicureans just means getting free of pain and trouble, and sort of pursuing that rather than sort of pursuing, public affairs or something like this. It's not quite a sort of private philosophy, but it's kind of close to it. Again, product of this much greater, much larger, more impersonal world people inhabit. And this, by the way, is just a manuscript from the 10th century AD. As you can kind of see, there's something's been written over. The older stuff on the bottom is actually something by a scientist from the Hellenistic period. This is the last one of the things we'll talk about here is art and sciences. But you also have literature continues in this period. One of the fun things that these Hellenistic monarchies do is they try to compete with each other. And again, it's competition, it's everything. They'll spend lavish money on the arts just to compete with their fellow monarchs. There's a story that the Ptolemies of Egypt tried to cut off exports of papyrus, which was the writing material they used back then, to another kingdom in order to stifle their supply of books. Which is not true, by the way, because they had parchment, but still, it's a great story. And anyway, one Ptolemaic ruler was supposed to have built a temple to Homer, supposedly. And whereas one Seleucid emperor actually wrote a poem on the best way to heal snake bites. So again, you have this literary culture being produced in these courts, but it's very different. Because the age of tragedy is over. Tragedy, which had to do with public affairs, is gone. There's a turn away from the life of the polis, from public life, to everyday life, to private affairs, to family, to satire. In particular, in drama, in plays on the stage. Excuse me. You're going to have the arrival of what's called the new comedy. And the new comedy is effectively what's called comedy of manners. You're making fun of people's, like nouveau riche types or something, those sorts of things. It's essentially a sitcom. That's effectively what this is, the new comedy. The most famous exponent of this is the playwright Menander. Dates there from the birth of 1442. I think it's the death of Aristotle. No, not from Aristotle. 342. What year was it? Anyway, from the middle of the 4th century down to the end of the beginning of the 3rd, which is again typical of the period. And poetry also changes. You had in the earlier period, I forgot to mention this, Pindar, the great writer of odes and people like this, in ancient Athens. Before that, oh boy, I've forgotten the woman's name. Brain died. But you had poems that were written for aristocratic symposia. Well, now things have shifted, and they're written by people at courts. And the two types of poetry that are most prominent in this period are pastoral poetry, first of all, invented by a poet, Theocritus. And what it does, basically, is an idealization of rural life. Again, you're living now in this cosmopolitan urban culture with its sophistication, but it's also got its problems. So naturally, when this happens, people begin to idealize the good old days. And the other thing that people write are epigrams, witty, short poems. Again, there's a sort of a shortening of ambition in a lot of ways in this bigger world in terms of literature. And then finally, in terms of mathematics and science as well, I mentioned Alexandria, the center of the Hellenistic world, museum as its research institute, the library as its repository of past Greek culture. But you also have lots of science going on. Euclid writes, his book, The Elements, becomes the textbook in the Western world for a long time on things like geometry. Then Archimedes of Syracuse, that text I showed you earlier, is actually his. He's the guy who invents the lever. He invents hydrostatics, which is has to do with water's property of standing water and things of that nature in that time period. And a couple of other major ones. Aristarchus of Samos, astronomer, who comes up with a heliocentric theory of the universe in the 3rd century. And then, of course, Ptolemy of Alexandria, whose geocentric theory will dominate the Western world until the 16th, 17th century. He's also, he's a great astronomer for the time. His theory makes sense at that time. And then finally, one last one I'll mention is Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who is creates writes a treatise on geography, but creates a map which is so accurate, a map of the world which is so accurate. He's a contemporary of Archimedes. His mathematics are so good that it basically calculates the circumference of the Earth. He knows its round, by the way, as being 24,675 miles. The actual circumference is 24,860 miles. He was less than 200 miles off. So you have this great flourishing of the world in this time period. I'll show you the actual map, what it looks like. You gotta say it's pretty interesting. We only know about 3 continents, but it's actually, again, it's relatively accurate for what they know about the world. And again, I go back to that word acumenate to end this lecture. By this time period, you begin to see the Greeks, no longer obsessed with the city-state, but looking at the entire world as being amenable to reason in some ways. Even if there's, fatalism about it to a certain degree, it still can be amenable universally. And that's one of the big things you get out of Greek culture in this time period. So that's the lecture for this week. Hope it was helpful. Enjoy reading your questions and discussion forum. So good luck. Take care. Have a great week, everyone. Hear from me next time.